The wagon wheel broke just outside Tombstone, Arizona territory, and Faith Shepherd knew it was the final cruel joke in a string of tragedies that had brought her this far with nothing but broken dreams and a carpetbag full of worn dresses. She stood on the dusty road under the merciless August sun of 1882, staring at the splintered wood as the merchant who had given her a ride shook his head and muttered about his bad luck, already unhitching his horse to ride ahead for help and leaving her there with her meager belongings and instructions to wait. Faith did not cry anymore because tears had dried up somewhere between St. Louis and the endless desert, somewhere between burying her parents to cholera and discovering that the man she had planned to marry had taken up with her cousin the moment Faith left town. She was 22 years old and felt ancient, hollowed out, a husk of the bright-eyed girl who once believed in happy endings and true love and all those foolish notions that seemed designed specifically to break a woman's heart. The heat shimmered across the barren landscape, making everything waver like a mirage, and she wondered if this whole journey was just another illusion, another mistake in a life that had become a collection of them. The merchant had promised her work at a boarding house in Tombstone, a respectable position for a respectable young woman, but Faith had learned that promises were as substantial as morning mist. She dragged her carpetbag into the sparse shade of a scraggly mesquite tree and sat down on a rock, removing her bonnet to fan herself. The silence of the desert was profound, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead, and Faith felt that silence seep into her bones. That was when she heard the thunder of hooves and looked up to see a rider approaching from the direction of Tombstone, moving fast, his horse kicking up a trail of dust that glowed golden in the afternoon light. Faith stood, smoothing her travel-stained skirts, trying to look respectable and failing miserably, she was sure. The rider slowed as he neared, and Faith saw a man in his late 20s with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that needed cutting, wearing a work shirt rolled to his elbows and denim pants that had seen better days. His eyes were a striking shade of green that seemed out of place in this brown and beige landscape, and he studied her with an expression that was more concerned than curious. "You the lady Bill mentioned?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble that somehow seemed to fit the vast emptiness around them. "Said he left a woman waiting by his busted wagon." "I am," Faith replied, lifting her chin despite her disheveled state, "though I did not realize I would be left like abandoned luggage." Something that might have been amusement flickered across the man's weathered face. "Bill's not much for patience, especially when money's involved. I am Ethan Bradley. I have a ranch about 5 miles north of here." He swung down from his horse with easy grace and walked over to examine the broken wheel. "This is not getting fixed today." "The merchant said he would send help," Faith said, though she heard the doubt in her own voice. Ethan looked at her with those unsettling green eyes. "Help costs money and Bill's tighter than bark on a tree." "Begging your pardon, miss, but you will be standing here come sundown if you are waiting on him." He glanced at the position of the sun, then back at her. "I can give you a ride into town if you are comfortable riding double, or you can wait, but I would not recommend being out here after dark." Faith considered her options, which were essentially non-existent. She had no money for a hotel even if she made it to Tombstone, and the boarding house position was supposed to start tomorrow. Standing in the desert all night was not appealing, and something about this rancher's steady gaze made her feel he was trustworthy, though Faith's judgment about people had been proven spectacularly wrong before. "I would appreciate the ride, Mr. Bradley," she said quietly. He nodded and picked up her carpetbag as though it weighed nothing, securing it behind his saddle before mounting and extending his hand down to her. Faith hesitated for only a moment before taking it, surprised by the callous strength of his grip as he pulled her up behind him with effortless ease. "Hold on," he said simply, and Faith had no choice but to wrap her arms around his waist as he urged the horse forward. The ride was mortifying and intimate all at once. Her body pressed against his back, feeling the heat of him through their clothes, the flex of his muscles as he guided the horse. Faith kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, watching Tombstone grow from a smudge on the landscape to a collection of buildings that looked barely more permanent than the desert itself. "You got people waiting for you in town?" Ethan asked after a long silence. "A job," Faith replied. At a boarding house, Mrs. Patterson's place, she felt him tense slightly. "Patterson sold out 3 weeks ago to a man who turned it into a saloon. You did not know," Faith's heart sank, though some bitter part of her was not even surprised. "No, I did not know. You got anywhere else to go?" "No." The word came out smaller than she intended, and Faith hated the vulnerability in her own voice. Ethan was quiet for a moment, the horse's steady rhythm the only sound. "I could use help at my ranch," he said finally, his voice careful. "My housekeeper passed this spring, and the place has gone to ruin without her. It is respectable work, room and board plus wages. I am not asking anything improper." Faith should have been wary, should have questioned why a stranger would offer her work, but she was so tired of being afraid, so exhausted from disappointment after disappointment. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." "I know what it is like to have nowhere to go," he said quietly. "And I need the help. My sister visits sometimes, so you would not be alone out there with just me if you are worried about your reputation." "I am afraid to hope," Faith confessed, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Every time I let myself believe things might get better, they get worse." Ethan turned his head slightly, enough that she could see his profile. "Then do not hope, just say yes or no." The simple pragmatism of it was oddly comforting. "Yes," Faith said. They rode into Tombstone as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that were almost painful in their beauty. The town was loud and rough, full of miners and cowboys and painted women calling from second-story windows. Ethan stopped at the general store long enough to pick up supplies, introducing Faith to the shopkeeper as his new housekeeper with a firmness that brooked no gossip. Then they were riding north again, into the gathering dusk, toward a ranch Faith could not yet see and a future she was trying very hard not to think about. The desert cooled quickly once the sun set, and Faith shivered in her thin traveling dress. Without a word, Ethan shrugged out of his work shirt and handed it back to her, leaving him in just his undershirt. "I am fine," Faith protested. "Put it on," he said, not unkindly. "You are shaking." She did, wrapping herself in the warmth that still clung to the fabric, breathing in the scent of sun and sage and something distinctly masculine. It felt too intimate, too familiar, but Faith was too cold and too tired to care. The ranch house appeared like a dark shadow against the star-studded sky, a sprawling adobe structure that looked solid and permanent in a way Faith had forgotten things could be. Ethan helped her down from the horse and grabbed her carpet bag while she stood there, swaying slightly from exhaustion. "You look about ready to fall over," he observed. "Come on. I will show you your room and we can talk about everything else tomorrow." The house was dark inside until Ethan lit a lamp, revealing a large main room with a stone fireplace and furniture that was sturdy but dusty. He led her down a hallway to a small bedroom that held a bed, a dresser, and a window that overlooked what she assumed was the ranch yard. "Bathroom is the next door down," he said, setting her bag on the bed. "I will rustle up something for supper." Faith caught his arm as he turned to leave, then immediately released it, aware of the impropriety. "Thank you," she said softly. "You did not have to do any of this." Ethan met her gaze, and in the lamplight his eyes were the color of summer leaves. "Maybe I did," he said cryptically, then left her alone. Faith sank onto the bed and allowed herself exactly 1 minute of sitting still before she stood and began to unpack her few belongings. She had learned that staying busy was the only way to keep the darkness at bay, and she was not about to fall apart now, not when this stranger had shown her more kindness than anyone had in months. The next morning came too early, sunlight streaming through the window and pulling Faith from dreams she could not quite remember. She washed her face in the basin on the dresser, changed into her other dress, which was only marginally less worn than the one she had traveled in, and made her way toward the smell of coffee. Ethan was in the kitchen, which was indeed a disaster, with dishes piled everywhere and a thick layer of grime on most surfaces. He looked up from the stove where he was attempting to fry eggs and bacon simultaneously with mixed results. "Morning," he said. "I am not much of a cook." Faith surveyed the chaos and felt something stir in her chest, something that might have been amusement or purpose or both. "I can see that. Let me." She took over the cooking while Ethan poured coffee, and they worked in surprisingly comfortable silence. Faith found herself studying him when he was not looking, noticing the way the morning light caught the gray threading through his dark hair at his temples, the lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, or used to. "How long have you had this ranch?" she asked as they sat down to eat at a scarred wooden table. 5 years, Ethan replied. "Bought it with everything I had saved from working cattle drives. It was barely standing when I got it, but it had good water and decent grazing land. Built it up from nothing." "And your housekeeper?" His expression softened with sadness. "Mrs. Chen. She was a widow who needed work, and I needed someone who could cook without burning down the house. She was 73 when she passed, peacefully in her sleep. I should have hired someone right away, but I kept thinking I could manage on my own." He gestured at the filthy kitchen. "Clearly, I was wrong." Faith took a sip of coffee, which was strong enough to strip paint. "What exactly would you need me to do?" "Cooking, cleaning, mending. Basic household work. I have 2 ranch hands who bunk in the barn, Jose and Tommy. They take care of the cattle and horses mostly. I can pay you $20 a month plus room and board." It was a fair wage, more than fair considering she would have a roof over her head and food to eat. Faith nodded slowly. "And your sister, Caroline? She is married to a banker in Tucson. She visits every few months, always worried I am living like a wild animal out here." The corner of his mouth quirked up. She is not entirely wrong. Over the next few days, Faith threw herself into bringing order to the chaos of Ethan Bradley's household. She scrubbed and swept and washed until her hands were raw. But there was satisfaction in seeing surfaces emerge from under layers of dust, in hanging clean curtains in the windows, and airing out rooms that smelled of neglect. Ethan was gone most days, working with his cattle or riding the fence lines, but he always came back for supper, and those evening meals became the rhythm Faith built her new life around. He was not much of a talker, but he listened when she spoke, really listened. His green eyes focused on her face like what she said mattered. Faith found herself sharing things she had not intended to share, about her parents' deaths, about the long journey west. Though she kept the betrayal of her former fiancé to herself, that wound still too raw to examine. Ethan shared too, in his quiet way. About growing up in Texas, about losing his parents young and raising his sister mostly on his own, about the years of backbreaking work that had led to this ranch, this life he had carved out of the harsh Arizona territory. "Why did you come west?" he asked one evening, A month into her stay, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, Faith was silent for a long moment. I wanted a fresh start. I thought maybe I could become someone different, someone who was not defined by loss. And have you? I do not know yet, she admitted. I feel like I am waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this to fall apart like everything else has. Ethan turned to look at her, his expression serious. You know you are not alone in that, right? Waiting for disaster. What do you have to worry about? Faith asked, genuinely curious. You have built a successful ranch, you have a home, a life. And I wake up every morning wondering when drought or disease or debt will take it all away, Ethan said quietly. I know what it costs to build this, and I know how fast it could crumble. Faith felt something shift between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, two people who had learned that hope was dangerous. Is that any way to live? She asked softly. Is there another way? She did not have an answer for that. The ranch hands, Jose and Tommy, were good men who treated Faith with respect and gratitude for the decent meals she provided. Jose was older, in his 50s, with a weathered face and a kind smile. Tommy was barely 20, eager and hardworking, with a mop of red hair and more freckles than Faith had ever seen on one person. They ate together at the big table, the four of them, and it felt almost like a family, though Faith was careful not to let herself think of it that way. Families could be lost, and she had already lost enough. One morning in September, Faith was in the garden she had started behind the house, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn earth, when she heard riders approaching. She shaded her eyes against the sun and saw Ethan returning from checking the north pasture, but he was not alone. A woman rode beside him, sitting her horse with confident ease, wearing a traveling suit that was far more fashionable than anything Faith owned. This had to be Caroline, the sister from Tucson. Faith brushed the dirt from her hands and went to greet them, suddenly conscious of her worn dress and the kerchief covering her hair. Caroline dismounted with Ethan's help and turned to study Faith with sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. She was beautiful, with the same dark hair as her brother but softer features, probably in her mid-20s. You must be Faith, Caroline said, extending her hand. Ethan wrote that he had finally found a housekeeper who could restore order to this disaster he calls a home. Faith shook her hand, feeling Caroline's assessing gaze. I have done my best. She has done more than that, Ethan said, and there was something in his voice that made both women look at him. The place has not been this clean since Mrs. Chen was alive. Caroline's sharp eyes moved between them, and Faith saw understanding dawn there. Though what exactly Caroline understood, Faith could not say. Over the next 3 days of Caroline's visit, Faith found herself unexpectedly liking Ethan's sister, despite her initial nervousness. Caroline was direct and witty, with a sharp intelligence that she had clearly learned to hide behind feminine manners when necessary. On the second evening, while Ethan was out with the ranch hands checking on a sick cow, Caroline helped Faith with the dishes, an offer Faith had initially tried to refuse. My brother is different with you here, Caroline said without preamble as she dried a plate. Faith kept her eyes on the soapy water. I simply keep his house clean and cook his meals. Faith, I am not blind and neither is Ethan. I have seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. Faith's hands stilled in the water. Mrs. Morton, that is not appropriate conversation. Call me Caroline, please. And it is entirely appropriate because I care about my brother's happiness, and I have not seen him this content since before our parents died. She set down the plate and turned to face Faith directly. He told me a little about your circumstances, about how you came to be here. Can I speak frankly? I suspect you will regardless of what I say, Faith replied, though without heat. Caroline smiled. You are right. Here is the truth. My brother is one of the best men I have ever known, but he has spent years building walls around his heart because he is terrified of losing what little he has. I think maybe you understand that fear." Faith finally met her gaze. "I do. Which is why whatever you think you see is just wishful thinking. Your brother was kind enough to give me work when I had nowhere else to go. That is all this is." "Is it?" Caroline asked gently. "Because from where I stand, it looks like two people who are afraid to reach for happiness, because they have been hurt too many times before." Before Faith could respond, they heard Ethan's boots on the porch, and Caroline gave her a meaningful look before returning to drying dishes, as though they had been discussing nothing more significant than the weather. That night, Faith lay awake in her small room, Caroline's words echoing in her mind. She had been so careful not to let herself feel anything for Ethan beyond gratitude, so determined not to hope for more than she had. But if she was honest with herself, truly honest, she had to admit that something had shifted in the months she had been at the ranch. She looked forward to Ethan's return each evening, found herself listening for his step, watching for his smile. She had memorized the way he took his coffee, the foods he preferred, the small tells that indicated when he was worried or pleased or tired. And sometimes, she caught him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, something warm and wondering that he quickly shuddered when their eyes met. But wanting something and being brave enough to reach for it were two different things entirely. Caroline left the next morning with promises to visit again soon, and a long, knowing look at Faith that said everything her words did not. Ethan rode with her partway to Tombstone, leaving Faith alone with her thoughts and a pile of mending. When he returned that afternoon, he found Faith in the kitchen, making bread. He stood in the doorway, dusty from the ride, and cleared his throat. "Caroline likes you," he said. "I like her too," Faith replied, punching down the dough with more force than necessary. "She said some things before she left, about me, about us." Faith's hand stilled. "There is no us, Mr. Bradley." "Ethan," he corrected quietly, "and is not there." "Because Caroline seems to think there is, or could be, and I have to admit, Faith, I have been thinking the same thing for weeks now." Faith turned to face him, flour dusting her hands and apron. "You should not say such things." "Why not?" He took a step closer. "We are both adults. We have been living under the same roof for months, and in all that time, you have brought life back to this place, to me, if I am being honest. I look forward to coming home now, to sitting across from you at supper, to hearing your thoughts on everything from politics to the best way to grow tomatoes." "Is that so wrong?" "It is foolish," Faith said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am afraid to hope, Ethan. I have lost everyone and everything that mattered to me. I cannot bear to hope for something good only to have it ripped away again." Ethan crossed the remaining distance between them and took her flour-dusted hands in his work-roughened ones. "I know that fear. I live with it every single day. But what if we are so busy protecting ourselves from loss that we are losing out on living?" Faith looked up into his green eyes and felt something crack open in her chest, something she had kept carefully locked away. "What if this does not work? What if we ruin what we have?" "Or what if it does work?" Ethan said softly. "What if we could be happy, Faith? What if we stopped waiting for disaster and started building something together?" A tear slipped down Faith's cheek before she could stop it. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple. Not easy, but simple. I am falling in love with you, Faith Shepherd. Maybe I have been since the day I found you standing by that broken wagon, looking so determined not to fall apart. And I think, maybe, you might feel something for me too." Faith's breath caught because he was right, and denying it would be a lie. "I do," she whispered. "I am terrified, but I do." Ethan raised one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away her tear. "Then be terrified with me. Let us be scared together and see what happens." He kissed her then, soft and gentle, a question more than a demand, and Faith answered by rising on her toes and kissing him back, flower and fear and hope all tangled together in that moment. When they finally broke apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "Court you properly, marry you if you will have me, build a life together. I know it is fast, and I know you have reason to be cautious, but Faith, I have never been more certain of anything in my life." "You hardly know me," Faith protested weakly. "I know you rise before dawn and hum when you think no one is listening. I know you are kind to Jose and patient with Tommy's endless stories. I know you cry when you read the letters you keep in your carpet bag, the ones from your mother. I know you are brave and strong and so afraid of being hurt again that you have built walls higher than any I have ever seen. And I know I want to spend every day showing you that you are safe with me, that hoping for tomorrow is not a foolish thing when we face it together." Faith felt more tears spill over, but these were different, softer, carrying something that felt dangerously close to joy. "I want to believe you." "Then believe me," Ethan said simply. "Or do not believe me, but stay anyway. Stay and let me prove it to you." The weeks that followed were a revelation. Ethan courted her the old-fashioned way, bringing her wildflowers from the desert, sitting with her on the porch in the evenings reading aloud from newspapers, teaching her to ride his gentlest mare so they could explore the ranch together. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, content to hold her hand or steal a kiss, building trust brick by careful brick. Faith felt herself unfurling like a flower in the sun, allowing herself to laugh freely, to plan for more than just the next day, to imagine a future that held something beyond survival. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. One evening in late October, as they sat watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky, Ethan turned to her with something serious in his expression. "I want to ask you something, but I need you to know you can say no, and it will not change how I feel or your place here." Faith's heart began to pound. "Ask." Ethan slid off the porch and knelt in the dust, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Faith Shepherd, I know we have not known each other long by some measures, but I have lived more life in these past months with you than in all the years before. You have become my reason to believe in tomorrow, my reason to hope that good things can last. Will you marry me?" Faith looked at him kneeling there, this good man who had taken a chance on a broken stranger and shown her that hope was not always foolish, that sometimes it was brave. She thought about the girl she had been, arriving in Tombstone with nothing but loss and fear. She thought about the woman she was becoming, who could imagine a future without flinching. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, I will marry you, Ethan Bradley." The kiss they shared was deeper than any before, full of promise and passion and the sweet relief of surrender, of finally allowing themselves to reach for happiness instead of bracing for disaster. They married 3 weeks later in Tombstone, with Caroline and her banker husband traveling from Tucson to stand witness, along with Jose and Tommy and half the town, it seemed. Faith wore a simple blue dress that Caroline had insisted on buying for her, and Ethan wore his Sunday best, which still carried the smell of the cedar chest it had been stored in. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Faith felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness she had thought she might never feel again. The wedding night was tender and sweet, Ethan patient and gentle as they learned each other in the lamplight, and Faith discovered that her body was capable of joy she had never imagined. Afterward, lying in his arms in the bed they would now share, she traced the lines of his face in the darkness. "I never thought I would feel this way," she whispered. "Safe and happy and excited about tomorrow." Ethan pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You have given me the same gift, Faith Bradley. I had accepted that my life would be work and solitude, that wanting more was dangerous. You showed me that the real danger was in not wanting at all." "We are quite the pair," Faith said with a soft laugh. "Two scared people who found each other in the middle of the desert." "The best things are found in unexpected places," Ethan replied. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. There was a drought that summer that tested every rancher in the territory, forcing them to make hard decisions about selling cattle and conserving water. Faith learned that being a rancher's wife meant more than keeping house. It meant working alongside him when the chips were down, helping drive cattle to better grazing, staying up all night with sick animals, making every penny stretch further than seemed possible. But they faced it together, and somehow that made even the hardest days bearable. Ethan had been right that night when he said they could be scared together and see what happened. What happened was that the fear became smaller when it was shared, divided between two hearts instead of one. The following spring brought better rains and renewed hope, and with it, Faith discovered she was pregnant. She told Ethan over breakfast on an April morning, watching his face cycle through shock and wonder and pure joy in the space of seconds. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Faith asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. Ethan came around the table and pulled her into his arms. "Happy does not begin to cover it. Terrified, maybe, but in the best possible way." Their son was born in December of 1884, arriving during a cold snap that had Jose keeping fires burning around the clock and Caroline arriving from Tucson 2 weeks early, determined not to miss the birth of her first nephew. They named him Daniel Ethan Bradley, and he had his father's green eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. Faith had never known exhaustion like those first weeks of motherhood, but she had never known such fierce love either, holding this tiny life they had created together. Ethan was a wonderful father, patient and gentle, walking the floor with Daniel during those long nights when the baby refused to sleep, singing old cowboy songs in his rumbling voice. Faith would watch them from the bed, her heart so full it seemed impossible that she had once been afraid to hope for exactly this. Daniel was 2 when Faith discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was harder, leaving her sick and weak for months. Ethan worried constantly, hovering over her until she had to shoo him out of the house to get his work done, though she secretly loved his concern. Their daughter was born in June of 1887, a tiny thing with dark hair and lungs that made it clear she would not be ignored. They named her Sarah Rose, after Faith's mother, and Daniel was instantly smitten with his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from feeding to diaper changes. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Ethan's careful management and Faith's frugal household skills allowed them to buy additional land and hire more help. Jose had become like family, and when Tommy married a girl from Tombstone, they built a small house on the ranch property for the young couple. Caroline visited regularly, usually timed to coincide with ranch events or birthdays, and the friendship between the two women had deepened into genuine sisterhood. On one visit, when the children were in bed and Ethan was out checking the stock, Caroline and Faith sat on the porch with coffee. "Do you remember what I told you that night when I first visited?" Caroline asked. "About you and Ethan being afraid to reach for happiness," Faith smiled. "I remember thinking you were far too meddlesome for your own good." "I was meddlesome and I have no regrets about it," Caroline said with a laugh. "But I was also right. Look at what you two have built together, Faith. A thriving ranch, beautiful children, a real partnership. You took a leap of faith, pun intended, and it paid off. It was not easy, Faith admitted. There were times, especially in those early days when I kept waiting for it to all fall apart. I had to learn to trust that good things could last, that I deserved happiness. And now, Faith looked out at the ranch spread before them, at the house that had become a home, at the land she and Ethan had worked side by side to build into something meaningful. Now, I wake up every morning grateful. Not fearless, exactly. I still worry about all the things that could go wrong. But I have learned that hope is not foolish when it is grounded in real love and real partnership. Ethan became my reason to believe in tomorrow, but together we built all the tomorrows that followed. He would say the same about you, Caroline said softly. That you saved him just as much as he saved you. Later that night, after Caroline had retired to the guest room and the children were sleeping peacefully, Faith slipped into the bedroom she shared with Ethan to find him already there, reading by lamplight. He set the book aside as she began unpinning her hair. "Everything all right? Everything is perfect," Faith said, and she meant it. She came to sit on the edge of the bed, and Ethan's arms came around her automatically, pulling her back against his chest. "Caroline said something tonight that got me thinking," Faith continued. "About how far we have come, you and I. Do you remember that first night when I told you I was afraid to hope?" "I remember everything about that night," Ethan said, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "You were trying so hard to be strong, to not let me see how scared you were. I think part of me expected you to be like everyone else who had disappointed me," Faith admitted. "I kept waiting for you to change your mind about helping me, about wanting me here. I never changed my mind. From that first moment, seeing you standing there by that broken wagon, something in me recognized something in you. Two people who had been knocked down too many times and were still standing. I knew I wanted you in my life. I just had to convince you to stay." Faith turned in his arms to face him. "You did more than convince me. You showed me that hoping for happiness was not naive, that building a life with someone could be safe and wonderful and full of more joy than I ever imagined possible." Ethan cupped her face in his hands, his green eyes serious. "You did the same for me, Faith. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You brought color and laughter and meaning to everything. This ranch was just a piece of land before you. Now it is a home. I was just a man working cattle. Now I am a husband and a father, and those are the titles I am most proud of." They kissed then, slow and deep, the kind of kiss that still made Faith's toes curl even after years of marriage. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I love you, Ethan Bradley. I love the life we have built and the family we are raising and the partnership we have forged. Thank you for being patient with me while I learn to hope again." "I love you, Faith Bradley," he replied. "Thank you for taking a chance on a dusty rancher who had almost forgotten how to dream." The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Daniel grew tall and lean like his father, inheriting Ethan's way with horses and cattle. Sarah turned out to be a force of nature, fearless and determined, keeping everyone on their toes with her boundless energy and sharp mind. When Faith was 35, she had one more surprise pregnancy that resulted in twin boys, Marcus and Matthew, who arrived early but healthy in the spring of 1892. With 4 children under the age of 10, the ranch house was loud and chaotic and full of life. Ethan hired additional help to manage the growing demands of both the ranch and the household. But Faith remained the heart of it all, the one who made sure everyone was fed and clothed and loved, who doctored scraped knees and broken hearts with equal care. The children grew up knowing they were cherished, that their home was a safe place built on a foundation of love that had survived doubt and fear, and the harsh realities of desert life. They learned the value of hard work from their father and the importance of hope and resilience from their mother. Jose became Uncle Jose to the children, and when he grew too old for hard ranch work, Ethan built him a small house near the main property where he lived out his days helping with light chores and telling stories to anyone who would listen. Tommy and his wife had children of their own, and the ranch became a community, a family of choice bound together by shared labor and mutual respect. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Faith by taking her to Tombstone for a rare night away from the ranch. They had dinner at the best restaurant in town and stayed at the hotel that had been built on the site of the old boarding house where Faith had expected to work all those years ago. You ever think about how different things could have been? Ethan asked as they lay in the hotel bed, the sounds of Tombstone's nightlife drifting through the window. If Bill had not left you by that wagon, if I had not come along, if you had actually gotten that boarding house job, Faith considered it. Sometimes. But I cannot imagine my life any other way now. Everything that happened, all the loss and pain that brought me here, it was terrible at the time, but it led me to you, to this life. I would not change that. I think about it too, Ethan admitted. About what a close thing it was, how easily we could have missed each other entirely. It makes me grateful for every day we have had together, every moment. 20 years, Faith mused. When you proposed, I could barely imagine 20 days without something going wrong. Now I cannot imagine a future without you in it. Ethan pulled her closer. You do not have to imagine it. We have proven we can weather droughts and difficult births and market crashes and all the other challenges life has thrown at us. We are stronger together than we ever could have been apart. You became my reason to believe in tomorrow, Faith whispered, echoing words she had spoken before. But we built something even better than I believed possible. They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion that had never faded. Two people who had chosen each other and continued to choose each other every single day. As the new century approached, the ranch had grown into one of the most successful in the territory. Daniel, now 16, was already talking about expanding into horse breeding, showing a natural talent for training that surpassed even his father's considerable skill. Sarah, at 13, had announced her intention to go to college, a declaration that would have been shocking a generation earlier, but that Ethan and Faith supported wholeheartedly. The twins, at 7, were still young enough to be more interested in playing cowboys and causing general mayhem than in their future careers, though Marcus showed signs of inheriting his mother's talent for growing things, often found in the garden helping with the vegetables. Faith stood on the porch one morning in the spring of 1899, watching her family go about their morning routines, and felt a profound sense of peace. Ethan was working with Daniel in the corral, the two of them moving in easy synchronization. Sarah was reading on the porch swing, already through more books than Faith had read in her entire childhood. The twins were helping Jose feed the chickens, their laughter carrying across the yard. This life, this beautiful, chaotic, imperfect life, was more than Faith had ever dared to hope for when she arrived in Arizona territory with nothing but a carpet bag and a heart full of fear. She had been so afraid to hope, so certain that reaching for happiness would only result in more pain. But Ethan had shown her that hope was not about being certain of outcomes. It was about having the courage to try anyway. Together, they had built a partnership based on trust and love and the daily choice to show up for each other, no matter what challenges arose. Ethan finished with Daniel and walked toward the house, his hair now more gray than dark, his face weathered by years in the sun, but his green eyes still sparkled when he looked at her the way they had that first night when he offered her a ride to Tombstone. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, climbing the porch steps to stand beside her. About how far we have come, Faith replied, taking his hand. About how a broken wagon wheel and a stranger's kindness changed my entire life. Ethan squeezed her hand. Changed both our lives. I was so lonely before you, Faith. I just did not realize it because I had convinced myself that loneliness was safer than risking my heart. We were both wrong about so many things, Faith said with a smile. Thank goodness we figured it out. Thank goodness for broken wagon wheels, Ethan agreed. They stood together watching their children, their ranch, their life, and Faith felt that old fear try to surface. That whisper that said good things could not last. That disaster was always waiting around the corner. But she pushed it down with the confidence of someone who had weathered 20 years of marriage and motherhood and partnership. Yes, bad things could happen. Life was uncertain and sometimes cruel. But good things could happen too, and often did. And the key was to hold on to the good while surviving the bad, to believe in tomorrow while being fully present in today. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into quiet, Faith and Ethan sat on the porch as they had done countless times over the years. The desert night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. You know what I realized today? Faith asked softly. What is that? I am not afraid anymore. Oh, I still worry about the children and the ranch and all the normal things, but that deep fear I used to carry, the one that said hoping for good things was foolish, it is gone. You loved it out of me, year by patient year. Ethan turned to her, his expression tender. You did the same for me. I used to hold everything at arm's length, afraid to get too attached to anything because I might lose it. You taught me that the risk of loss is worth it for the joy of having something worth losing in the first place. Quite the pair of philosophers we have become, Faith said with a laugh. Quite the pair, period, Ethan replied, pulling her close. As 1899 turned to 1900, the ranch celebrated not just a new year but a new century. They threw a party that brought together everyone who had become part of their extended family over the years. Jose, now in his 70s, held court telling stories of the early days. Tommy and his wife, their children now teenagers, helped organize games and activities. Caroline and her husband came from Tucson, and even some of the neighboring ranchers and their families joined in. Faith moved through the crowd, ensuring everyone had food and drink, accepting congratulations and well wishes, and marveling at how full her life had become. This house that had been filthy and neglected when she first arrived was now bursting with laughter and love, the center of a community she and Ethan had helped build. Late in the evening, Ethan found her in the kitchen, taking a brief respite from the party. Hiding? He asked with amusement. Catching my breath, Faith corrected. I am not as young as I used to be. None of us are, Ethan agreed, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. But we are still here, still standing, still together. That is worth celebrating. Faith leaned back against him. It really is not it? We made it, Ethan. We built a life that has lasted, that has meaning, that has brought us more joy than sorrow. We did, he agreed. And we are not done yet. We have years ahead of us still, Faith. Years of watching our children grow and make their own lives, maybe grandchildren someday, more memories to build together. I look forward to it, Faith said, and realized she meant it without reservation. I look forward to every tomorrow with you. They returned to the party together, and when midnight struck and the 20th century officially began, Ethan pulled Faith into a kiss while their children groaned in embarrassment and their friends cheered. To the next century, Ethan said when they broke apart, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. May it be filled with as much love and laughter as the last 20 years have been for my family. "Here, here," Jose called out, raising his glass, and everyone joined in the toast. Faith looked around at all the faces she loved, at the home she had helped build, at the man who had become her whole world, and thought about that scared, broken girl who had arrived in Tombstone all those years ago. That girl had been afraid to hope, afraid to reach for happiness, convinced that good things were not meant for her. But she had been wrong. Good things were meant for everyone willing to be brave enough to try, to stay when it would be easier to run, to hope when hope seemed foolish. Ethan had been the catalyst, the rancher who offered kindness to a stranger and changed both their lives forever. Together, they had proven that tomorrow was always worth believing in, that love could heal old wounds and build new dreams, that a life built on partnership and hope could weather any storm. Years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenges. Daniel married a schoolteacher from Tombstone when he was 22, a sweet-natured woman named Elizabeth who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a house on the ranch property and began working toward Daniel's dream of adding horse breeding to the ranch operations. Sarah defied expectations by not only going to college, but becoming a teacher herself, returning to Arizona territory to open a school for ranch children who had previously had to travel great distances for education. She was passionate and determined, and Faith saw echoes of her own resilience in her daughter's fierce independence. The twins took different paths. Marcus stayed on the ranch, developing his talent for agriculture and turning the garden Faith had started into something approaching a small farm operation, growing produce they sold in Tombstone. Matthew showed more interest in the business side of things, handling accounts and contracts with a head for numbers that served the ranch well. As Faith and Ethan entered their 50s, their children grown and starting families of their own, the ranch transformed again. It was no longer just the two of them and hired help. It was a multi-generational operation with Daniel and Elizabeth living in one house, Sarah visiting frequently from her school in town, and the twins still living in the main house while they saved money for their own futures. The first grandchild arrived when Faith was 52, Daniel and Elizabeth's son, who they named Ethan after his grandfather. Faith held the baby in her arms and felt the circle complete somehow, this new life carrying forward the legacy she and Ethan had built. "We are old now," Ethan joked as they sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset much as they had for over 25 years of marriage. "Speak for yourself," Faith retorted, though her hair was now streaked with gray and her hands showed the wear of decades of hard work. "I prefer to think of us as seasoned." "Seasoned like old leather," Ethan agreed with a laugh. "But seriously, Faith, look at what we have created. Not just the ranch, but this family, this legacy. Our grandchildren will grow up here, maybe their children after that. We built something that will outlast us." Faith reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "We built it together. That makes all the difference. I could not have done any of this alone." "Neither could I," Ethan said softly. "You were always the strong one, the brave one. I just provided the land and the initial invitation." "You provided much more than that," Faith disagreed. "You gave me a reason to stop running from the future and start building toward it. You showed me that I was worthy of love and partnership and happiness. That was the real gift, Ethan. Not the ranch or the security, but the belief that I deserved good things." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky shifted through shades of orange and pink and purple, the desert putting on its nightly show. Faith thought about all the sunsets they had watched together, all the mornings they had greeted side by side, all the days and nights that had woven together into a life. If you could go back and talk to that young woman standing by the broken wagon, Ethan said. "What would you tell her?" Faith considered the question carefully. "I would tell her that being afraid is not the same as being weak. I would tell her that the man offering her a ride is offering much more than that, if she is brave enough to accept it. I would tell her that tomorrow is worth believing in, even when today seems impossible. And if I could talk to the rancher who found her, what would you say? I would tell him to trust his instincts, that the woman he found is going to transform his entire life in ways he cannot imagine. I would tell him to be patient, to give her time to learn to hope again, and that the wait will be worth it beyond measure." Faith leaned her head on his shoulder. "We have had a good life, have not we?" "The best," Ethan confirmed. "And we are not done yet." He was right. They had years ahead of them still. Years of watching their grandchildren grow, of supporting their children in their various endeavors, of continuing to work the land they had built their life around. There were more sunsets to watch, more challenges to face, more moments of joy and sorrow to experience together. When Faith was 60, she and Ethan traveled back east for the first time since she had left all those years ago. They visited St. Louis, where she showed him the neighborhood where she had grown up, now changed almost beyond recognition. They stood at her parents' graves, and Faith introduced them to the man who had become her whole world. "I wish you could have known him," she told her parents' headstones. "I wish you could have seen the life we built together, the children we raised, the love that grew from that first meeting in the desert." Ethan stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and Faith felt the weight of decades of love and partnership supporting her as she made peace with the past. They also traveled through Tombstone, which had grown and changed significantly since Faith first arrived with nothing but a carpet bag and shattered dreams. The town was more civilized now, less wild, though it still retained the rough edges of its mining heritage. "It is strange," Faith said as they walked down Allen Street. "I remember being so desperate when I arrived here, so certain my life was over. I could not have imagined that the best parts were still ahead of me." "That is the thing about hope," Ethan said. "It does not require you to see the future clearly. It just requires you to believe the future is worth seeing." They stopped at the spot where Ethan had first brought Faith into town on his horse, that intimate ride that had marked the beginning of everything. The buildings were different now, the street wider and busier, but Faith could still remember the feel of her arms around Ethan's waist, the fear and desperate hope warring in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing me when I was at my lowest and offering me a chance at something better." "Thank you for taking that chance," Ethan replied, "for being brave enough to say yes when you had every reason to say no." On their 40th wedding anniversary, the family threw a celebration that rivaled the New Century party. All 4 children were there with their families, grandchildren ranging from infants to teenagers running around the ranch. Jose had passed away peacefully 2 years earlier, but Tommy was there, now retired from active ranch work but still living on the property with his wife. Caroline had also passed, succumbing to illness the previous year, and Faith felt her absence keenly. But she knew her sister-in-law would have been thrilled to see the family gathered, to see the proof of that initial matchmaking instinct that had pushed 2 scared people toward happiness. During the party, each of the children stood up to speak about their parents, sharing memories and lessons learned. Daniel talked about his father's patience and work ethic. Sarah spoke about her mother's resilience and determination. The twins shared funny stories that had everyone laughing until they cried. But it was the youngest grandchild, just 5 years old, who brought Faith to tears when he stood up and said simply, "Grandma and Grandpa love each other, and they taught us all how to love." Out of the mouths of babes, Faith thought, wiping her eyes. That evening, after the guests had departed and it was just the two of them again, Ethan and Faith sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. 40 years, Faith marveled. We have been married for 40 years, Ethan. We have loved each other for longer than I lived before meeting you. Best 40 years of my life, Ethan said. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but his green eyes still held that same warmth that had drawn Faith in from the beginning. I meant what I said all those years ago. You became my reason to believe in tomorrow, and you have given me more tomorrows than I ever dreamed possible. We gave them to each other, Faith corrected. That is what partnership means. We built this life together, brick by brick, day by day, through droughts and abundance, sickness and health, fear and hope. Through it all, Ethan agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. Faith thought about that broken wagon wheel that had changed her life, about the choice to accept help from a stranger, about the slow building of trust that had blossomed into love. She thought about learning to hope again when hope seemed foolish, about allowing herself to believe in tomorrow when today was all she could handle. She thought about the man beside her, who had been patient enough to let her find her way to loving him, brave enough to love her when she was too scared to love herself. I am glad I was afraid, Faith said suddenly. Ethan looked at her in surprise. What? I am glad I was afraid to hope, that I told you about that fear. Because you did not dismiss it or tell me I was being foolish. You acknowledged it and then showed me, through action and time and unwavering commitment, that hope was not naive. You let me come to it in my own time, and that made all the difference. You would have gotten there without me, Ethan said. Maybe, Faith allowed, but it would not have been as sweet, and I would not have had you beside me for the journey. You were exactly what I needed when I needed it most, Ethan Bradley, a rancher with a kind heart and the patience to let a broken woman heal. You were never broken, Ethan said firmly. Hurt, yes, scared, absolutely, but never broken. You were always strong, Faith. You just needed someone to remind you. And you were that someone, as you were for me, Ethan replied. We saved each other. That is what love does. As they entered their 70s, the ranch continued to thrive under the management of their children and grandchildren. Daniel had successfully expanded the horse breeding operation, and the Bradley Ranch was now known throughout Arizona territory for producing quality stock. Sarah's school had grown to serve over 50 children from various ranches and farms, providing education that had previously been out of reach for many families. Marcus had turned the garden into a genuine agricultural operation, experimenting with different crops and irrigation techniques that increased yield and efficiency. Matthew managed the business side of things, ensuring the ranch remained profitable even as the West continued to change and modernize. Faith and Ethan officially retired from active ranch management when Faith was 72, turning over the reins to Daniel while maintaining their residence in the main house. It was strange at first, not being responsible for the daily operations that had defined their lives for so long, but they adjusted. They spent their days reading, tending to a small flower garden Faith had always wanted but never had time for, playing with their numerous grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company after a lifetime of hard work. We earned this, Ethan said one afternoon as they sat in rocking chairs on the porch, watching the younger generations work the ranch. Years of building, of struggling, of pushing through. We earned the right to rest. I rather enjoy it, Faith admitted, though I miss being useful sometimes. You are still useful, Ethan protested. You teach the grandchildren to cook and sew and garden. You tell them stories about the old days. You love them and guide them. That is incredibly useful, Faith. She smiled at him, always knowing the right thing to say even after all these years. I've had a lot of practice, Ethan said with a wink. When Faith was 75 and Ethan 77, they took one last trip together, traveling to California to see the ocean. Neither of them had ever seen it, and it had been a dream of Faith since childhood. They stood on the beach hand in hand, watching waves crash against the shore, and Faith felt a sense of completeness. She had been so many places, experienced so much, and through it all, Ethan had been her constant companion. "It is beautiful," she breathed, the salt air filling her lungs. "It is," Ethan agreed, though he was looking at her rather than the ocean. "Thank you for bringing me here," Faith said, "for giving me a life where dreams like this could come true." "Thank you for dreaming them with me," Ethan replied. They returned to the ranch with stories to share and a renewed appreciation for the life they had built in the desert. The ocean was magnificent, but it was not home. Home was the ranch, the family, the land they had poured their lives into. On a quiet evening in late autumn, when Faith was 78, she and Ethan sat on the porch wrapped in blankets against the cooling air. The sun was setting in a blaze of color, and Faith felt a profound sense of peace. "You remember what I confessed to you that first day?" she asked softly. "That I was afraid to hope." "I remember everything about that day," Ethan replied, his voice rougher now with age but still warm. "You became my reason to believe in tomorrow," Faith said, repeating words she had spoken before, but that still held truth. "But what I realize now, looking back over all these years, is that you did not just give me hope. You gave me the courage to build a life worthy of that hope. You showed me that I was strong enough, brave enough, worthy enough to have good things and keep them." Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "You gave me the same gift, my love. A reason to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, that building a life with someone was worth the risk of losing them someday." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Faith felt the weight of 78 years, of a life fully lived, of love given and received in abundance. "If I had to do it all again," she said quietly, "knowing everything that would happen, all the joys and sorrows, all the fears and hopes, I would still choose you. Every single time." "As I would choose you," Ethan replied. "Every day for the rest of my life I choose you, Faith Bradley." They kissed then, soft and gentle, the kiss of two people who had loved each other through decades of life, who had built something lasting and true from the ashes of broken dreams and desperate hope. The stars began to emerge one by one, filling the vast desert sky with light, and Faith thought about all the nights she and Ethan had watched this same sky, all the hopes and dreams they had shared under these stars. She thought about the woman she had been and the woman she had become, the journey from fear to hope to love to contentment. And she thought about tomorrow, about the days and weeks and years still ahead, however many they might be blessed with, and she felt not fear but anticipation. Because with Ethan beside her, tomorrow was always worth believing in. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carrying forward the legacy they had built. But the true legacy was not the land or the buildings or the cattle. It was the love, the partnership, the proof that two broken people could find each other in the vast wilderness and build something beautiful together. Faith had been afraid to hope, but Ethan had taught her that hope was not weakness but courage. And together, they had lived a life that proved hope was always, always worth the risk. As they sat there under the stars, Faith rested her head on Ethan's shoulder and allowed herself to feel completely, perfectly happy. They had made it. They had built a life, raised a family, loved each other through every challenge and triumph. And they had done it together, exactly as it was meant to be. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, bringing whatever joys or sorrows it might hold. But Faith would face it without fear, with hope in her heart and Ethan by her side, just as she had for more than 50 years. And that, she thought as sleep began to claim her in the comfort of her husband's embrace, was the greatest gift of all. A tomorrow worth believing in, and a love that made every tomorrow brighter than the last.